Welcome back to Psychology Masters. Today's episode is based on the first of 10 insights provided in an article recently published in PNAS. The article is called "The Pandemic Exposes Human Nature, 10 Evolutionary Insights." Using the lens of evolution, the expert authors depict fascinating insights they have developed into our humanity over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Access to the paper is free, and the link to it can be found in the description below this video. Now, if you enjoy this episode, I strongly recommend you read this paper in order to take a deeper dive into the source material and what inspired me to make this video. So, the first perspective in the paper comes from Professor Athena Aktipis and Professor Joe Alcock. Athena and Joe describe how the virus might alter host sociability. So, to begin, pathogens manipulate our physiology to enhance their own survival. This is uncontroversial. Some viral pathogens infect host cells and use the host cell machinery for the virus's own replication. In this instance, cell machinery refers to the ingredients that viruses use to make copies of themselves. Take, for instance, the different amino acids and lipids you would find in a cell. Now, in my previous episode of Psychology Masters, I discussed what I believe to be the false dichotomy between human physiology and psychology. I elaborated on what I consider to be an inextricable link between these two systems. I highly recommend you check the episode out so you can have a better idea of what I mean when I talk about this false dichotomy between human physiology and human psychology. The link to the episode will appear just above my head. Anyway, with the idea of this false dichotomy in mind, consider the possibility that pathogens don't only disturb functioning near the site of infection. Perhaps a pathogen might initiate a cascade of effects that ultimately manipulate human behaviour. Severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2, or, as known by my 3-year-old niece as that pesky virus, may be suppressing feelings of sickness during times of peak transmissibility. One of the COVID-19 virus's characteristics is that it has a high rate of viral shedding. Now, the peak of this viral shedding, and therefore its transmissibility, occurs 1 to 2 days before the onset of symptoms. Now, it is very possible that the virus is suppressing the host's typical symptoms of viral infection, for example, feeling ill and being tired, to increase its transmissibility. When people have this ill feeling or fatigue, they tend to keep to themselves. Naturally, if the virus was inhibiting these symptoms in some way, the infected person would be more likely to interact with and therefore infect other people. This would increase the success of the virus. Now, I'm not suggesting that the virus could be consciously concocting some sort of diabolical plan. I'm only suggesting, as Athena and Joe so eloquently do in the paper, that the virus may have evolved to generate such complex effects in humans. This is despite the virus itself being a relatively simple entity. Now, some fascinating research conducted by Chris Reiber and colleagues in 2010 seems to provide some support for this idea proposed by Athena and Joe. Reiber and colleagues administered a flu vaccine to their experimental group, having measured their social interactions in the 48 hours leading up to the jab. Now, the results demonstrated that the experimental group interacted with significantly more people in the 2 days after the flu jab than in the 2 days before it. Now, the relationship between the flu vaccine and increased social interaction was correlational, and as always, caution should be exercised when interpreting this type of correlational data. However, the fact that this finding is extremely interesting, at least to me, is indisputable. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Now, it is very possible that viral effects on the sociality of the host could simply be a byproduct of a separate mechanism of the virus. Take the virus's activation of the host's antiviral immune response, for instance. This disrupts something called interferon signaling. Interferons are a group of signaling proteins involved in the immune response. Now, as you can imagine, interferon signaling is modulated when the body is infected by a pathogen, unsurprisingly. Well, research involving participants whose interferon signaling is manipulated demonstrates a change in these participants' behaviour. they often experience depressed mood and withdraw socially. Considering this, it is very possible that by changing interferon signaling, a natural response of the body to infection, as I said, the virus can maybe coincidentally change the host behaviour. Now, not because the virus is acting specifically to change the host behaviour, but maybe simply because the virus is activating the normal immune response of the host. To me, this represents a problem that I sometimes notice occurring in evolutionary thinking, and something indeed I have been guilty of when I think through that evolutionary lens. People can use evolutionary thinking as an excuse to conduct post-hoc analysis of observations without first attempting to develop a comprehensive insight into the prior causes of these observations. When observing events in the world, it is human nature to attempt to string together a coherent, satisfying, pattern narrative to describe the events. However, the truth of an event does not have to converge upon the narrative we project onto it. Hence the scientific method of testability. My point is, if you are thinking in an evolutionary way, ask yourself, how can I test my idea? What experiment could I conduct to see if the implications of my idea pan out? What type of experimental result would render my idea untrue? Now, if you cannot come up with ways to answer these questions, either your initial idea wasn't great, or perhaps there's just a failure in your imagination. Now, thankfully, Athena and Joe had no such failure of their imagination. They advised researchers to catalogue neurological, psychological and behavioural symptoms of COVID-19 along with the physiological symptoms, and create a repository of associated biological samples from these patients. Now, they also advise research to identify whether certain suites of symptoms are associated with particular genetic variants of SARS-CoV-2 and of SARS-coronavirus 2, and whether natural selection is favouring variants that are associated with more neurological symptoms. In conclusion, SARS-coronavirus 2's effects on our human nature may be a result of evolutionary adaptations of the virus itself. Athena and Joe expertly advise that if SARS-coronavirus 2 has evolved to manipulate our behaviour for its own benefit, we would do well to better understand specifically how this happened. Indeed, this understanding will affect how we treat, manage and model that pesky virus in order to make it less harmful to us. Thank you so much for watching today's episode of Pat Psychology Masters. I hope you enjoyed it. Comment what you thought of this video. Did you agree with Athena and Joe's evolutionary perspective? Did you enjoy their thoughts? Perhaps you'd like me to make another episode based on a different perspective from this perspective paper. Make sure to comment beneath this video and let me know. As always, hit thumbs up if you liked this episode, hit thumbs down if you didn't, subscribe and make sure you hit that bell icon to see next week's episode. My channel is free and always will be. Thanks again so much for watching.